Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello all of you there. Welcome to the 9th week of our course Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. In fact, this week begins with short fiction. Now if you recall, we began with Elements of Literature, Introduction to Literature, and from there we moved on to discussing poetry in detail. We took about 4 weeks to discuss poetry, and then we moved on to fiction. In fact, we took about 3 weeks to discuss fiction, and now in this week we are going to discuss short fiction. Now of course we have already discussed fiction. Now based on our discussion of fiction, if we can introduce short fiction, well, no wonder if you consider short fiction as a kind of a little brother or little sister of fiction, right? You are not wrong when you consider it as a little brother or little sister, but there are a lot of similarities between fiction and short fiction. In fact, the organizing principles that govern fiction and short fiction are same. The structural principles that govern fiction and short fiction, they are same. And as we said in one of the previous classes, the difference is only in scale and magnitude, because the scale of novel is much more compared to the scale and magnitude of short fiction. You get to discuss lot many things, whereas you will have to achieve all that in a limited span, in a limited space when it comes to short fiction, right? Therefore, in this week we can take up untethering short fiction and examine various features of short fiction and understand what short fiction is, and varieties in short fiction and historical origins of short fiction until through its modern manifestations. Okay, so this is what we have in mind. Before I deal with a formal definition of short fiction and its varieties, I am going to take you through two of the shortest stories that you can think of. In fact, the first one is attributed to Hemingway. Of course, it is quite debatable whether Hemingway actually wrote that or not. However, in the popular imagination it has been associated with Hemingway. So, let us forget the authorship for time being and focus on this particular short fiction. In fact, it is considered as the shortest fiction, probably one of the shortest stories, the short story, you can say it. Look at it, just about 6 words, the first one. And there is a story behind this. In fact, it is said that Ernest Hemingway was sitting in a pub with a couple of his fellow writers, and they thought they could begin with some kind of a bet, maybe to go to take the drinking to an altogether different level. They thought they would mix it up with whatever they were writing. So Ernest Hemingway seemed to have wagered that he would construct a short story in about just 6 words, which would make his fellow writers, it would move them like anything. And his fellow writers thought this guy could not do that. They said fine, maybe during those times in 1920s, 30s, right. So they wagered something like $10 or $20, and that is when Ernest Hemingway seemed to have come up with this short story. That is the story behind the story. Okay. Now look at this: for sale, baby shoes never worn. If you are a sensible reader, or if you have a little more patience, you would almost be moved to tears when you read this. Now, what is so remarkable in this short story? or what is these 6 words when put in this particular order, what are they conveying? A sensible reader would tap the reservoir of life's tragedy when he or she reads these 6 words. There is a very grim tale, there is a very tragic tale hidden behind these 6 words. I am sure if you read it a couple of times, you would come across what it is trying to say. Now look at this. Who will auction a sale, especially, or who will sell baby shoes never worn? Probably a mother who was expecting a child and in anticipation of that bought some shoes and maybe clothes, and the baby was stillborn or something happened, and here is she with this, for sale baby shoes never worn. An entire range of tragedy that consummates the life of a mother or young parents is presented in these 6 words, for sale baby shoes never worn. These words are capable of evoking a vast stretch of tragedy behind the utterance of these words. In other words, these words uncover a sad tale of young parents using them. They just open the words and you peep into, or you can get a peek into the vast stretch of tragedy that may have happened in the life of those young parents. That is all. These words act as a door, and the moment you read them, they just open the door and you are made to see that. This is what a short story is capable of doing. This is the potential of a short story, right? Just less than 6 words. Now, can you imagine? Less than 6 words, and it conveys a powerful, tragic tale that accompanies the life of these young parents or any young parents. For sale baby shoes never worn. From there, let us move on to the second short story. Of course, this in a slightly elongated version, we must have discussed it in one of our earlier classes, especially while discussing elements of fiction. Nevertheless, it is a tale taken from Aesop's fable. Of course, we are going to discuss Aesop's fable in a little more detailed way in subsequent slides. This is another short story. Now, look at it. Less than, let us say, 18-20 words, less than 20 words, but how powerful it is. A vixen, Mrs. Fox, sneered at Mrs. Lioness, because she never bore more than 1 cub. If you know, well, a fox, when it gives birth, at least a few puppies, 5 to 6 puppies. So she makes fun of the lioness, and the lioness, undisturbed, responds, "You are right, only 1, but it is a lion." Of course, very minimum use of conversation. There are just 2 characters here, and even the setting is not very well known. Of course, these are various elements of short fiction too. We have discussed them in the context of fiction, but we will also discuss them in the context of short fiction. Setting is morphed. There are 2 characters and very minimum background, some kind of a third person narrative and dialogue between vixen and a lioness, and look how proudly she says, just a verbal picture, and it is again capable of conveying a range of themes, a range of ideas, right. So, before we discussed formally, before I gave you the definition of short fiction, different elements of short fiction, theoretical underpinnings to short fiction, I thought it's better we get a taste of short fiction and what this particular genre or what this particular form of literature is capable of unfolding before us. All right. I am sure these two examples will have given you the power pack that a short fiction holds under its breath. So, now let us quickly go and take a look at what a short fiction is. This is how most of them that we have quoted here are exemplary practitioners of fiction and short fiction. So, this is what these writers of short fiction have got to say about short fiction. Let us begin with Bates. So, this is something like, depending, look how remarkable it is. Anything the author decides, it shall be. So, this talks about the amorphous nature of short fiction, because there are some forms, there are some genres of literature that are quite rigid. We have discussed them, right. They are rigid. It is difficult to compose them in the sense, if you wish to compose, you have to follow to certain conventions, certain norms, they work under tight schedule. Whereas, fiction and short fiction, they are quite amorphous. You can shape them the way you want it, or it is just like water, it assumes the shape of the vessel you put water into, right. If you put into a round vessel, shape of water looks round. If it is a square vessel, square, things like that, right. It is quite amorphous. So, you get one particular nature of short story through this. By nature, short story is amorphous and malleable, like any metal that you can give shape to, right, like iron or gold or even silver or any other metal which has the characteristic feature of malleability, which you can shape it into different shapes, So, short story can assume that is precisely what it is talking of. Now, Edgar Allan Poe, in fact, one of the remarkable short story writers, the world has seen, he says this: a short fiction is basically, or a short story is basically, a prose narrative which is short in nature, which requires anywhere between half an hour to 2 hours in its reading. Perusal is reading, right. So, it talks about the quick time span, the temporal definition of short story. A short story is a short sequence of narrative, short prose narrative, that you can finish anywhere between half an hour to, let us say, 1.5 to 2 hours, because there are like you have read the short stories, there are also very longish short stories. Let us say, for instance, Death of Ivan Ilyevich, the best ever short story that Tolstoy ever wrote. It runs into something like 70-80 pages, almost as good as a short novel. There are many short stories which are about 80 to 100 pages, right. So, therefore, a short story is something that you can finish somewhere between half an hour or less than half an hour to 2 hours. Neil Gaiman, a contemporary short story writer, and an academic and a literary critic, says something remarkable. He says short stories are tiny windows into the other worlds. They are just tiny windows into other worlds and other minds and other dreams, right. It is just like a window. Through that window you can enter into the other world, other mind, others' dreams, and the journey that you take in order to make to the far side of the universe, and you still can come back for dinner, right. Even if you start sometime in the evening, the journey it entails is, you can just go read it and come back in time for dinner, something like that. That is the remarkable voyage, the spatial, spatially and temporally, this is what short story gives you. It takes you across to a different mind, to different dreams and to different universe, and transports you back in time before your time for dinner or breakfast, depending on when you begin reading it. Then Scott Fitzgerald, we need no introduction to him, we have discussed Fitzgerald. He says, in order to write the short story, you need to find the key emotion. This may be all you need to know to find your short story. Well, here is a great insight for you to be short story writers. If any of you are nursing ambitions of becoming short story writers, here is the key. Identify the key element. When we say the key element, key emotion. In other words, every story will have a major feeling, an emotion that it wants to convey to the readers, and it conveys it in a very beautiful way. There is no scope for a range of emotions, a vast gamut of feelings that that you can find in novels. Novel permits you to do that, whereas in short story, stick to one key emotion or feeling, then see how you can develop it. Maybe if time permits, we can even take up an activity wherein we can even make you write short stories, but until then, remember, identify the key emotion. So, every story will invariably have one. Now, David Sedaris says, a good short story would take me out of myself and stuff me back in, outsized now and uneasy with the fit. Now, look at this. In fact, these are not just random quotes we have gathered here. We have carefully curated these quotes so as to give you, an idea about short story from different perspectives. Now, what is this particular quote doing here? In fact, it talks about the impact of short story. Now, Scott Fitzgerald's definition talks about the key ingredient of short fiction. What is the key ingredient of short fiction? Now, Neil Gaiman's, it talks about, again, the impact of short fiction, more than the impact, the kind of transaction that happens when you read when you read short fiction. The transactional nature of reading short fiction is unveiled when you read Neil Gaiman's. And Edgar Allan Poe talks about the temporal concept of short story, which can be read and finished in less than about 1 hour to 2 hours, something like that. And Bates' definition talks about the very nature of short story. So, these different definitions approach short story from multiple ways. So, David Sedaris, he talks about the impact of short story. Now, having read a short story, you feel, if you are lucky when you have read a short story, you feel, you have been expanded, your consciousness has expanded. So, therefore, when you try to get back into your original self, you feel slightly uncomfortable because you are heavy with what you have gathered after having read the short story, right? You are heavy because, as I said, immediately after you have read a short fiction, you are still dripping with the effects of having read the short fiction. Therefore, it may be difficult. It's something like this, that immediately after you come out, you find it difficult to wear your clothes because because of various things. Or imagine you've just expanded yourself and you have the old clothes, and when you want to fit yourself in, you have to struggle a lot, right? Something like that, the impact of short fiction, right? So, this is why I'm sure these definitions should give you an overall idea about what short fiction does. And some more insights about short fiction. One is by H.G. Wells, another remarkable writer, H.G. Wells. He says a short story, it should be, the intention of short story is to produce one single vivid effect. Of course, echoing on one of the other short story writers who talks about identifying one key emotion, right. So, here too H.G. Wells seems to echo that you need to produce one single vivid, very lively effect in a short story. And how do you compose it? When you write, you should write it in such a way that it should seize your attention right in the very beginning, because remember, unlike the novel, which gives you the luxury of expanding your introductions into several pages, a short story does not give you that luxury, because you have the constraint of pages, you have the constraint of time. Therefore, whatever you have to do, you have to start doing it right from your first sentence, right from your first paragraph, right. That is the reason why the moment it begins, it must seize the attention, capture the attention of the reader, and it should not leave it until the climax is reached. Like, once you get under the grips of the short story, it only lets you go when you reach towards the end of the short story, something like this. All right. Now, yeah, here is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a remarkable novelist. We have discussed him earlier, and also an extraordinary short story writer. He distinguishes short fiction from a novel or fiction. He says a short story is like an arrow that hits the bullseye, whereas a novel is like hunting rabbits. So, novel, it requires a lot of patience, it is an entire game in itself, whereas short story, there is no time, you have to, wherever you are, just aim for it, hit the bullseye, that is it. This is Marquez for us. After this, let us see, now having understood various components of short fiction, we have Edgar Allan Poe and also G.K. Chesterton, who have something remarkable to add to whatever we have read. G.K. Chesterton says that there is a reason why modern human beings in the 19th, 20th century, especially in the 20th century, they are fond of this particular short fiction. So, there is something in the very form of short fiction that makes them, that human beings are attracted to, the very form. Forget what the content says, the very form of short fiction, the structure of short fiction. What is it? The structure of short fiction is symptomatic of the sign of fleetingness and fragility, right, because we do not have modern human beings, we do not have the luxury of a detailed life, in the sense we always hurry, we are always in a hurry, right. That is the reason why we are drawn to short stories, because it tries to give you whatever it gives you in the short span of leisurely time that you have. You do not have lot of leisurely time at your disposal. Therefore, within the short span of time, it tries to give you the effect that you desire, or that you want, or that you hope to get it in a novel. What is that? A sense of fleetingness, a sense of fragility that comes to define modern human beings. If there are two characteristic features that define modern human beings, or modernity itself, that is fleetingness and fragility, right. So, short story is capable of conveying that, right. So, it can give you an existence of an illusion in a wonderful way. That is why it has the quality of dream, it has an air of a dream, right. Something when you wake up, it disappears. Similarly, short story too, in its impact. So, these are some things that we can keep in mind while understanding short fiction, all right. Now, we have already discussed elements of fiction, more or less short fiction too, or short story too. What is the difference between short story and short fiction? Of course, we get to know, but today we almost use them in a synonymous way, though there is a subtle distinction between short story and short fiction, because short story has come to dominate the very form of short fiction. Short story is one of the components of short fiction, but today it has come to almost dominate the form. That is why most of the times you find people interchanging the term, right. But we get to discuss various other forms of short fiction, but here whether it is short story or short fiction, these are the 5 different elements. We have already discussed them in detail, but let us quickly take a look at them. The first is character. You need to have a set of characters, not an elaborate set of characters, at least a few characters, maybe two, but of course, in the very shortest story that we read, there are no characters. Remember, these are no rules. Without any of them, or with just only one of them or two of them, you can construct a short story. We have discussed that, So, these are the various permutations and combinations writers use in order to construct their stories. Now, the second is setting, the third is plot, an element of conflict. Towards the end, we get an overall theme of the short story. Let us quickly take a look at what exactly they mean. When we say character, it means why things happen to people, and or other words, who acts. A story should necessarily have an event, right. So, who is a part of that event, or who acts so as to cause that event, incident. In order for an incident to take place, it should happen to somebody, right. Who are those peoples? That gives you characters. Now, look at what Henry James, another important modernist writer, says about short story. Especially in the context of short story, he says it to the character. What is character but the determination of incident? What is incident but the illustration of the character? That talks about how integral character is, the element of character is to the incident and illustration of character. Of course, there is a pun on the word character here, because character is a person that appears in the story. It is also the characteristic feature, it is also the characteristic feature, characteristic trait of that person, right. So, it is a pun. Now, when we say character, so what we need to focus on is a few questions. What is the person saying here? Because that reveals something about the character, right. What is the person saying? And then what is the person doing? Because what a person does also defines a person there. What others say about the character. In order for us to understand the whole character, we need to know it in the context of other characters, what other characters say, and what others do, maybe as a response to the chief character or on their own. What do they do? And what does this character look like? If you answer all that in a very convincing and a proper way, then you will have created an extraordinary character or a set of characters in your short story. Okay. Now, from character, let us go to setting. As we have already identified, setting can be a physical location, or it can be a time in the story. It could even be an imaginary setting, anything like that. Let us say, for instance, if you have read R.K. Narayan's novels or short stories, Malgudi appears to be an important place. It is not a physical space, it is an imaginary space, it is an imaginary place constructed by the writer. So, something like that. So, it talks about either a location which has a which corresponds to the geographical location, or it could as well be an imaginary place. It could be a description of a landscape, buildings, seasons, scenery, even the weather, because if a particular story takes place in a rainy season, then that becomes the setting, right. And it can as well, why does the writer have to give the settings? Because settings have the capacity to give you the feeling of authenticity, because when a reader visualizes an event taking place in a particular locality or time horizon or in a space or in a particular weather, it helps the reader visualize that plot in a better way, right. In order for the writer to help the reader visualize what is narrated better, a writer makes use of setting. That is something that we can keep in mind. From setting, let us go to plot, another important component. Plot is an important component. We have defined plot when it comes to fiction in a detailed way. A plot is a series of events around which an entire story revolves, right. Of course, story is an integral part of plot. So, not just story is a sequence of events, chronology, and plot means it also adding the cause and the result effect, cause and result effect. So, generally speaking, a good plot should have a neat beginning, it should have a clear middle where it is developed, where the plot that has begun is properly developed, and it should have a thorough ending. This is something that Aristotle also talks of when it comes to a play, which is another distinct form of literature, which we take up next week probably. Okay. So, this is it should have a proper beginning, middle and the end, and with all necessary descriptions, exposition, suspense and all of them. In fact, the Freytag's model that we discussed can as well be applied to a short story here. These are some things that we can keep in mind while understanding plot. From here, let us go to another element, the fourth element, conflict. Conflict is a very, very important thing, because every story should necessarily have an element of conflict to solve. Otherwise, the story may become quite boring, right. So, the plot is centered around this conflict, and the characters try to resolve this conflict in one way or the other. If they resolve it, it becomes a successful story and it becomes a successful character. If the character is unable to resolve this conflict, then it becomes a tragic ending or a failure. In either way, it is absolutely all right, you know. If you can arrive at a resolution, positive one or a negative one, or even your inability to resolve can as well be a good story, you know. That is why conflict is very, very important. In fact, out of the conflict, you take it, the rising action, climax, the falling action, all of them hinge around the component of conflict in fiction as well as short fiction. Okay. Finally, we come to theme. This is a very important thing. Again, as we discussed in the context of fiction, theme is not a summary, you know, theme is not a summary. Theme is about the central vision. What is the overall vision of this particular short story, or what is the motive, you know, the hidden motive. Sometimes it can as well be explicit, sometimes it may be implicit, you know, or what is the precept of life, what is the experience of the life. So, all these things can revolve around, you know, they give you an idea about the theme in a particular short story. For instance, you know, if you have read The Gift of Magi, you know, so the gift of Maggie, then it is love, generosity, sacrifice, all of them can be that. So, any story that you read, generally there is a theme. Even in the story that we read in the very beginning, you know, there is that the tragic tale of the mother is the theme, you know, the death of you know, the child, the stillborn baby, you know, that is the theme, and the tragedy that follows it, it becomes the theme. Or in the second one that we read, Vixen, you know, how the proud lioness responds, you know, assertiveness. It is more than the quantity, quality matters. That is a kind of an inherent theme that is there. So, these are various things that we can think of when it comes to elements of short story. All right. I hope you enjoyed this class. In the next class, we begin with different types of short fiction, and you know, and the origins of short fiction until, let us say, through its modern manifestations. We will take it up in a little more detailed manner. All right. Thank you.